Welcome to the deep dive. We are starting today by, well, completely flipping the historical script.
Right.
When you study the great wars of history, the books always celebrate the military victors. You see the parades, the territorial gains, the flag raising.
Mm-hmm. The glorious victory.
But what if the nation that won the war was, financially speaking, crippled by the effort, and the true lasting victor was someone else entirely?
That is the central and I think often ignored paradox of global power. Our sources for this deep dive focus on a single, really stark question.
Okay.
During a war, who sheds the blood? And then once the fighting stops, who is the one who's truly counting the money? Our mission today is to uncover how war debt acts as this silent, invisible master, fundamentally controlling the political and economic landscape of entire nations and ultimately of individuals.
Right, because the sources are arguing that while a war might end on the battlefield with a signed treaty, the real power shift, the one that defines generations, happens later, quietly, in the boardrooms of banks and on the ledgers of national debt. The debt itself becomes this incredibly powerful lever of control.
Exactly. We have to look past the military narrative. What we're doing here is exploring the structural economics of conflict. We're trying to discover how an empire can technically achieve a brilliant military victory only to emerge utterly crippled by the financial costs of that very success. Debt, in this context, is a weapon more potent than any battleship.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The clearest example from modern history has to be the situation for the victors, right after World War I.
Perfect example.
When you look at the Great War's aftermath, the reality for the official winning nations, I'm talking Britain and France here, it's just bizarre.
It is.
They secured the physical victory, but they were also standing on what the source material calls broken legs of debt. They had literally spent their national treasure to win.
They paid for it with massive loans, often loans denominated in gold or in foreign currency. So both Britain and France, which were, the world's preeminent colonial powers at the time,
The biggest empires.
they found themselves struggling immensely. They were forced into these really desperate measures, selling off national assets, stripping their colonies for cash, and constantly pleading with their creditors for debt reduction.
And here is the crucial financial pivot. The primary creditor, the undisputed new master of the global balance sheet, was the United States.
The leverage the U.S. gained was just profound. They entered the war late, so they hadn't incurred those first 3 years of financial devastation the Allies faced. And crucially, the U.S. had extended these massive war loans to the Allies
Right.
and demanded payment in gold or hard currency. This caused a physical repatriation of wealth. I mean, gold was literally shipped across the Atlantic, draining European coffers and filling America's.
So the U.S. wasn't just wealthy. They had secured the global position that Britain used to hold. We're talking about the transition from the British pound sterling, which dominated everything, to the rise of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. That is the definition of financial dominance.
And this placed the U.S. in a position of undeniable power over its former allies. Britain and France were the military champions, sure, but the U.S. held the purse strings. And what's fascinating is the cold, unyielding stance of the creditor. The sources distill it into this simple, just chilling statement: victory is your problem, the debt is ours.
Wow. That one line it encapsulates the entire difference between military power and financial power, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Military power decides the outcome of a battle. Financial power decides the long-term structure of global governance.
It does. And this analysis leads to a really profound conclusion, one that I think shapes the way we should read history. An empire doesn't necessarily collapse because it's militarily defeated.
Right.
It collapses, slowly and silently, from failing to manage and repay its debt. This financial truth is the real silent killer that's just absent from the common historical narrative.
The parades were for the military victory, but the funerals were for the national balance sheet.
Well said.
So if we accept that military conflict is force, then the source forcefully argues that debt is the shackle. And it's a shackle that binds the victors and the vanquished.
Right.
So if debt is the shackle, we need to understand the rules. What are the unspoken laws that govern this dynamic?
That's right. The sources distilled this whole relationship into 3 fundamental, unchanging laws. And they apply universally, whether we're talking about 2 people or 2 competing superpowers.
Okay, let's hear them.
Law number 1 is the financial law. And it's simple, almost brutal, but constant. The lender decides the fate of the borrower. Full stop. This rule transcends ideology, national size, everything. If you hold the debt, you hold leverage. You can demand specific internal policies, trade agreements, even leadership changes from the debtor nation. Debt inherently creates control.
And if you control the fate of the nation, you control more than just its economy. You control peace itself.
Precisely, which brings us right to law number 2, the power law.
Okay.
The holder of money controls peace more than war. Think about the sheer implication of that. War is about forcing immediate submission, right?
Yeah, brute force.
But peace, after the guns fall silent, requires rebuilding, investment, future planning. This peace is decided not just by treaties, but at the financial negotiating table, where the creditor dictates the terms of the debtor's long-term survival. The one who finances the peace dictates how long that peace can last.
And this is where the sources analysis gets, well, deeply relevant to modern politics. Because the third law moves us from economics into the socio-psychological realm. It shows how this financial pressure translates directly into extremism and chaos.
Exactly. Law number 3 is the socio-psychological law. And this rule states, when a people feel squeezed by debt, they will choose extremism.
And the prime example has to be Germany after World War I.
A perfect illustration. The punitive reparations debt demanded by the Allies.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just an economic burden, it was an existential humiliation.
So it wasn't just the amount of money, it was the constant feeling of national oppression, this idea that your children and their children were being born into debt owed to foreign powers. That's what created the conditions for radicalization.
Absolutely. The financial injustice, the hyperinflation, the inability of the government to provide basic stability, it created a populace that was desperate for an explanation and for a savior.
Mm-hmm.
This feeling of being cornered and oppressed enabled the rise of fascism, which offered simple, violent solutions and very clear scapegoats for the economic collapse. Financial despair directly fuels the desire for radical political overhaul.
So debt is far from just arithmetic. It's the spark of history. It creates the systemic tinder that determines which political systems survive and which future conflicts become almost inevitable.
It connects the dots. It shows the line between a national spreadsheet and the rise of a destructive political movement. It reveals that financial constraint and injustice, they're perhaps the most powerful precursors to transformative societal violence.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on how this structural debt operates on a huge geopolitical scale, bringing down empires, fueling radicalism. But let's shift focus for a minute. If nations are constrained by this external financial debt, what does this massive global dynamic teach us about the structure of our own individual lives? How does that shackle of national debt compare to the debts we carry?
That's the ultimate synthesis the source provides. It argues that every individual faces 2 parallel types of debt, and they mirror that national experience.
Okay, tell us about the 2 debts.
So first, there's the obvious one, money debt. It's quantifiable, it's recorded, it's repayable through labor or assets. We all get that. But the second type is what truly dictates the course of a life, the debt of consciousness.
Debt of consciousness.
It's defined as a profound lack of awareness or ignorance about one's own self-defeating behavioral, emotional, and financial patterns.
That distinction makes the concept so much more powerful. We're not just talking about being unconscious, we're talking about a measurable, unpaid internal debt.
Exactly. Think of it as intellectual and emotional arrears. On the national scale, debt forces a country to repeat economic mistakes. On the personal scale, if this debt of consciousness is not acknowledged and repaid through awareness, it forces the individual to repeat cycles of failure, toxic relationships, financial self-sabotage over and over again, often without even understanding why.
So the source is saying that the true bondage people experience isn't primarily caused by external forces like the economy or just bad luck,
Right.
but by a lack of awareness about these invisible internal debts. The internal balance sheet is what really dictates our freedom.
It reveals that the path to true personal sovereignty, to finally escaping those repeating patterns, it requires the same rigorous internal audit that a nation should apply to its finances.
And the source actually provides a clear path forward, doesn't it? It's a sort of 4-step framework for moving from being trapped to being, well, proactive and conscious.
It does. The first step is simple recognition, framed as pattern sovereignty. You have to clearly see and articulate the nature of the destructive cycle you're in. You can't solve a pattern until you can name it.
The second step is causal clarity. You have to diligently work to understand the root cause of the entrapment. Why did I fall into that pattern? What weakness or ignorance allowed that debt to start?
The third is intentional action. You must act proactively with wisdom. You refuse to be passively led by old emotional habits or external pressures. This means refusing to let your debt, whether it's financial or conscious, automatically dictate your fate. You have to seize the steering wheel.
And finally, the fourth step, which I think reflects the global dynamic we started with. Generative awareness. You become a person who actively spreads that very same awareness to others. You shift from being a debtor to becoming a source of liberation for your community.
And to connect this all the way back to our central theme.
Hmm?
War ends on the physical field, yes. But true peace, whether for a superpower or for an individual seeking freedom, only begins when people escape the structural constraints imposed by debt, and particularly that paralyzing debt of ignorance. That is where true, lasting sovereignty resides.
That is a phenomenal synthesis of the material. What this deep dive suggests is that gaining this knowledge isn't just a personal exercise, it's an act of power. It's similar to how the U.S. gained power by controlling the financial narrative after World War I. And the sources suggest that if this dialogue resonated with you, the next step isn't just to mull it over, but to act on that fourth step, sharing this awareness. Who in your life is currently caught in a repeating financial or mental cycle they just can't see? The act of deliberately sharing this knowledge with them, of illuminating their pattern, is the first act of becoming a leader, not just a follower. By sharing this light, you solidify your own freedom. Think about that responsibility and that opportunity. Until next time.